Alright, ladies and gents, so I'm just going to reveal my little shader here. Please feel free to pause the video at any given point in time if you want to be able to recreate this. I'll be running through the different nodes, so this isn't really so much a tutorial. I will explain some of the things as I go through it, but it's more just kind of revealing the overall recipe for this setup. So the first things, of course, that you're going to need are a noise texture that you'll need for the visual element. We've got just anything that you want to use for that. So this is what I did. I found some real sort of VCR noise, made it seamless so that it could tile, and then applied this as color burn, and then a little bit of multiply of the same thing just to darken it out and just give the kind of band that I remember seeing on some of the old TVs and VCRs when they totally went crazy. Another element that I need is my flicker texture. My flicker texture is a 64 pixels across and 4096 tall. And this is just going to pan its way slowly through this to be able to reveal different sections. And this is going to provide two different things. Number one, it's going to provide a sort of pulsing element where it makes the glitch turn on and then turn off, and that's going to be then altered even further by the lower scale version of this, where you can actually see individual bars going across, and so these bars will become horizontal bars passing upwards through this. So if we go back to our shader, we can see that happening. And you can see some wobbling and flickering, which is happening through other elements in here. So there's warping and distortion of those textures in order to get this result, and then you see these individual single bars passing through as well. So we start off with this horizontal bands, and the horizontal bands I've set with a slow general move. The bands are technically moving upwards and to the left, but you're not seeing it because they wrap. The only thing that I could have done here to change this would have been using a vector 2 instead, so by pressing 2 and then clicking, and then controlling just one versus the other, because this controls sort of the X negative and positive direction and the Y negative and positive direction to control this shader. So moving right along, I have this currently going into a mask. This is only because I had previously used something other than screen position. I decided that screen position would be the best overall, even though it's always facing camera. I felt in this particular situation it wouldn't really matter, and I always wanted to see that horizontal bar going through. If I wrap it on texture, because these are three-dimensional forms, when I have those horizontal bars go through, it'll end up looking kind of like loops, and I really didn't want that. I wanted this like one straight line going through this whole thing, so I didn't want to look like weird sort of donut things passing through it. I wanted that TV screen kind of look. So that's why we're using screen position instead. I did try some other things though, so I tried world space positions and whatnot, which is where the mask had to actually come into play, and that was because the panner can only receive a U and V information, so it's a 2 vector. It's a what is it? Float 2, I think it's called in this one. It needs that, so only red and green. And in order to get this mask, you just right click and you say component, and then you can go with component mask. So that's passing into this panner, and of course then a speed is being applied. This other value here is actually controlling the scale of the texture, and so this 0.1 value is determining the size of the bars, how thick they are. So all this is coming through these horizontal bands, passing up and down. And then I'm just masking off again, but I'm just taking a single channel because I only need one channel. It's black and white, and I just need it for masking and multiplying against some other things. So I've got it piling down into the deformer here, into a multiply, which you can just create and kind of let float there while you learn what the rest of them are. And this other path, which is going down, we'll follow it down here, it's going into my glitch texture, which is the noise texture that's in here, and it's controlling that with a lerp, and the lerp is set to 0, so basically it's making the glitch texture appear and not appear in these horizontal bars. That's actually going through something else as well, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So that's this section right here. Let's move over to our flicker, which is kind of the heart of a lot of this overall thing. A flicker, a really good flicker, is very useful. This recipe that I'm using here can be used for what I'm using it for here, or it can also be used to control things like a flickering light. So if you wanted like the flickering torch pattern, and I've got this noise element, which if I change the scale of it, it creates some interesting kind of patterns which can be kind of useful. So again, it's using screen position, and I've got control over the panner here with a speed, an overall speed that's passing through this. So what I'm doing is I'm actually moving a noise, and that's creating this flicker kind of element, all these little warbles, because this is actually a fairly small scale noise, 0.001. I believe, is that going through the deformer? Sorry, this is the small scale noise. So yeah, 10. So this is the tiny noise. So with noise, the larger the number, typically the smaller the pattern is, and the smaller the number, the bigger the pattern is. And so this noise is larger because it's being used to control things like sine waves. So again, if I change this value to something larger, like a 1 or a 5 or 10, then I would get smaller patterns. So this panner, because it is only releasing 2 values, so x and y, or r and g, I'm using some masks to pull the r and the g out and then put them back into a make float. So these are component masks, and this is the make float 3, and I'm just plugging it in here in order to get that. I don't really need the Z channel. I could leave that empty. What I really need is something that outputs 3 values, and so that could be left as a 1 or a 0, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But what this is doing is it's moving it all in 3 axes, and 2 of the axes are at the same speed. The third one could be a different speed. And so what we've got here is like a 2, which is passing through here, and so the x direction is 2, while the y and z directions are both traveling at a speed of 4. So that's going into my noise pattern. Noise pattern is going into a multiply, which is not currently being used. I have this in here for additional modification purposes, should I desire to change things a little bit further. But as is, I'm kind of happy with it. And that would be altering a sine wave pattern. So sine wave is just an up and down kind of movement, and this is changing the overall speed of that pattern. And it's doing it in different sort of regions. So the sine is then being passed through another thing, which is controlling speed. So that's what this would do, is it would help control the speed. So taking this on and off value, so black and white, 0, 1, and then multiplying it against something else would change the speed of this sine wave. But this is just going into its default speed. But this one is not. This one is going faster. And so it's passing through, when this is peaking, this guy gets to play. And when it goes down into the nothingness, this guy turns off. And so we're getting these sudden glitches, and then nothing, and then a few bumps and going. and it's all very uneven because it's passing through this noise. So this is giving me a lot more randomness than this top part of the chain, which is also being used. So this is one sine wave is then being multiplied against the other sine wave, and they're all being applied against this other one, which is a bit more predictable. So if we just looked at this one, you'd see a very predictable pattern. It's not as random, but it is more consistent, right? So I'm trying to use this to get a lot more consistency in that it's happening frequently, and yet I want to then break that apart a little bit further. So I've got time, I've got the speed that's going into the multiply, and we've got the sine wave. So this is the speed of the sine wave because we're using a multiply node here. Then that again is passing through another multiply which has a slower speed, so 0.2, and it's going into the next sine wave, and again they're multiplied together. So ultimately this is all controlling the flicker. This is just the flicker itself. Now this thing is how we can use a panner on a noise. And so because I've already set it up and it's using screen position, it's got speed that's related to what I'm trying to do here anyways, I just piped it off and reused it again for the second noise pattern. And again, as I said, this noise pattern is more tiny, like the little dots are smaller, and it's creating these little flicker bits. And they're being multiplied by the vertex normals in world space. And what this basically means is that it's pushing them, rather in a specific direction, it's pushing them outwards based on this information. So by multiplying that information here, we can then also apply this flicker information, which determines when it happens and when it doesn't happen. So this would just create noise. The whole thing would warble and flicker all over the place and constantly be doing it. But it's being stopped doing that by this pulsing coming off of here through this multiply. It's also being altered based on this pattern, which is moving upwards and downwards through this. So you see these lines passing upwards, and occasionally you'll see the actual warble itself actually pass upwards through the form, and that's because of these horizontal bars. So these horizontal bars are passing into this next multiply, which then passes into this final one. This final set, which is a value, this value determines how far from the surface does it push. So smaller numbers and you get less distance from those little vertices. And I made them fairly large because I wanted to be able to see them from a distance. So that's up to you. You can determine if you want kind of like little wiggles or big wiggles. Technical term, wiggles. Okay, so all of that is passing down in here into a lerp, and that lerp is going into the world position offset of the shader. That lerp is being controlled, its alpha is being controlled, and I hate when it pops like this. It's hard to follow. So if you follow this line going down in here, you see it's coming from this. So this guy is it's a final say all, like control all, for both the distortion here as well as the opacity. This is another version of my horizontal lines, and I don't know if we can see it or not. If I drag it up and down, you're not going to see it properly because I've actually changed its scale to be super huge. So by bringing this much smaller number, the texture itself has been scaled up so large that all you're seeing is a big volume of white and then eventually a big volume of black. And this is being passed through yet another panner. So again, we're changing the scale of the texture. I'm masking it off, which I probably do not need to do because I think this is just U and V values anyways. And it's passing into this panner, which is moving this again in an upwards direction. And because it's so huge, the end result of what it looks like visually is sort of on and then off when it reaches a black section. And so how wide that bar was in either white or black will determine how long the pause is between distortion and not distortion. So you can play with that at your discretion. So it's just another form of creating sort of a flicker element, but it's sort of like slowly going on and off, and the thinner bars will turn on and off much faster. So again, just masking the off just a single channel because it's black and white, and using it to control the lerps of these. So that's my deformer, and this is my flicker. And so my flicker is also passing down into my glitch texture, down into here, but we'll get to that in a second, so just remember that that's there. So this little wonderful thing, it's coming off of screen position. Everything here has been based off of screen position. Again, because I want it to always sort of face the camera. I want these lines that are bars and stuff like that to sort of represent a TV screen, which we're used to seeing as two-dimensional. When you make something like that three-dimensional, it looks a bit weird. So I want to give that kind of feeling. The main issue that I had was with screen position information is it's locked to the screen. So it's always the same resolution. This basically just becomes a portal or sort of a window into that space. So what I wanted to control was the ability to zoom in and zoom out and have that texture change in scale. Now in terms of this solution, it works really well for something that is chaotic like this, but if you did something like with like a brick pattern or whatever, there is a strange sort of side effect in the way that it scales in and out, and so it looks like things sort of translate. It doesn't scale from the center, it scales from like an upper corner. So just be aware of that. I think it's from like the top left corner it scales. But for this case it works just fine. So what I have here is the change in overall scale, so the overall size of the resolution that I want to use. So screen position, this changes the overall starting scale of the texture. And then this is the adapter. So we have actor position and camera position into a distance node, which will of course alter it. So it changes the number, which we then multiply against the current resolution, the current size of the texture. This is going into the actual glitch texture. And so the glitch texture is a few different elements. So the texture is way over here, but we're doing some other things to it here. And I've got this noise, which is set to, looks like a fairly large size. And it's, because there's no position input, it's going to be a little bit different in scale. Like when you input values into position, you're already altering its scale and its overall resolution, quite frankly. So if it has nothing, it's using its defaults, and so these values will be a little bit different depending on whether or not you've plugged something into the position or if it's empty and doing its own thing. So this is creating little patterns here and there, little small areas, and I'm using those red and green channels because I'm using them to control UVs. When you control UVs with an image rather than just pure numbers, it will distort and warp around the white and black values, which is really quite cool, and that's what I wanted. I wanted a little bit of warping of that noise to give that kind of wiggle element to the texture itself. So I'm taking that and passing it through the original UV information and the change of scale that's happening here. So they're kind of combining together. What I am using this lerp for, however, is something that I like to do a fair bit. And I like to take a lerp and use it to control how much of it I want to use. And so with this 0.99, I'm actually using mostly the value of 0, which is nothing. So I'm only using a 0.01 value of the actual noise in order to distort it. And the reason for this is that it can be a fairly large distortion, which can make the pattern fairly unrecognizable. So by applying a very small amount of this noise, I only get like a little warble to that effect. So that's controlling the panner, and so it's moving around that noise pattern, sort of like ripples in the water. And we've got the speed of the panner going here. I've got a single value, which means it's pushing an X and Y at the same speed. And that panner is then going in and adding to the flicker. So this sort of moving element is then being applied to all of this. And so I think ultimately what this element is looking like is just an overall major distortion, and this is an amplifier of that. So every once in a while you'll see the whole thing will kind of wiggle and glitch out. That's not just the deformation of the surface, it's this flicker coming into play, multiplying against this noise and the initial texture size. So by applying this, it's actually scaling it and warping it even further in little bursts here and there. And that's where you're getting this major wiggle freak out from this, which is kind of cool. So I'm taking that and putting it off to the side so that I can pass it through a lerp later. So this is me just using just the subtle distortion changes that I have here. Rather than the major ones, it's just passing the texture up and passing through this little wobble. And I've got a multiply node that I don't need anymore. Again, I do a lot of experimentation, and sometimes I don't clean up my mess because I'm a horrible person. Anyways, so that doesn't actually need to be there, but it's passing down here into the multiply, and the multiply changes the appearance of what it's doing here. So this right here is changing the final scale again, because I believe it changed in scale previously, and so I'm altering that. By taking this through the lerp here, the lerp allows me to control how much of that major distortion from the flicker will happen, and I'm just doing 50-50, so it's working out okay. That passes into the UVs, and you can see the result here. I then pass it yet again through a lerp because I want to control how much of that texture I want to go in here, and I want it to be faded and subtle. So again, I'm only using about 0.1 of this actual texture because of this lerp's current setting. So 0 is black, and it's mostly black. So it's passing into that lerp that we mentioned from before, which is coming up here from my horizontal bars. And the horizontal bars are controlling the alpha between this lerp, which is again either show this texture, which is glitching and doing all this wonderful stuff, or show black. And so when you see these horizontal bars come through, these ones right here that you see, that is actually basically turning off this texture. It's on and off. Combined with that is our good friend Mr. Fresnel. So Fresnel makes the edges white and the interior black by default. That's sort of what Fresnel is meant to do. So you have an exponent which determines how much coverage you get here, and then the base value. So what the smallest value is. So if I set this to 0, this probably would turn completely transparent, which is not actually what I want. I wanted a little bit of information, sort of a filmy kind of look in there, so I'm leaving it at 0.04. So it's controlling this lerp again, which is the mixture of this stuff, to a value of 1, so turning it on. So keeping it whole versus not there, which means that this is actually fairly intense, but it's then passing through another Fresnel. This other Fresnel is, or not Fresnel, sorry, this other lerp, so this copy of the Fresnel. So I have Fresnel here, either do the regular Fresnel or do my distorted version of the Fresnel. And that's being controlled on and off by this fade in and fade out glitch. So the fade in and fade out glitch is the same one as the original horizontal bars. The difference is that it's just been scaled really large, which I believe we've already discussed. So I think that is about it. We've got the entire shader all kind of put together, and the final thing is just this color, which is 10 and 10, which makes it really intense, which adds a bit of a glow around it, which is what I wanted, and then the opacity takes it down. So I had to go really intense to get any glow at all. I could probably go even further should I desire, like 100 or something like that, and then that would be like super intense. And of course it's going to have to recompile, but that would probably make it much more opaque as well. So you get this balance between, is it glowing enough for me or is it not? And if you want more glow, you end up with something that's a bit more opaque. And it's this challenge because then you can't just turn around and say, well, I'm going to make it more transparent, because when you make it more transparent, there's less of it to glow. And so you lose the glow element again. So you can always change the parameters for your glow in the settings to try and change how far it glows if you desire. So this is the overall glitch texture. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I've got a couple of other examples, just objects that you can see it here. And the only thing else that I haven't mentioned about this is the shader itself is a surface set to translucent, and its translucency value is currently set to surface translucency volume. And the reason why I changed that is so that I can have access to a normal map at a later point in time. So this has been the recipe. Hope you enjoyed it. Well done.